last day and a half about how humbled we are by the speakers, presenters, and panelists that have joined us for this first, I don't know, maybe it's our first annual, who knows, but our first virtual crisis conference. And that humility extends right into our next guest, Dr. Satyamoorthy Kabilan, affectionately known as Dr. Kabi. I've got your bio here, Kabi, but I just want to say, and I want to digress for just a second. One of the smartest men I've ever met, who has incredible insights to disasters, and fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, when Dr. Kabi was with the Conference Board of Canada, he dug into how the city of Calgary responded to the 2013 floods, during which I was charged, of course, with the communications on behalf of the municipality. So Kabi and I have a great connection, and that connection comes through the Calgary Emergency Management Agency. Kabi's passion for emergency management translates every time he speaks. His connection and depth of skill and expertise for crisis communications and the connection to emergency management is so inspiring to me. And so I'm so glad you're here. Now I got to read your bio. Also, Dr. Kabi, because we're all on social together, I think it would be good for you and I just to say best wishes to Chief Tom Sampson. There are a lot of people on here from Alberta and Calgary in the area. Chief Tom Sampson of the Calgary Emergency Management Agency announced his retirement tomorrow, and that comes after a long career with the paramedic service. He was actually my chief when I was a paramedic, and he was with the fire service, and for the last several years heading up the Emergency Management Agency. So I think Dr. Kabi and I would both like to say best wishes to Tom. Dr. Kabilan is an internationally recognized emergency management expert. He has led a number of key research initiatives on emergency management, including the assessment of the response and recovery to the 2013 floods in Calgary and lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy and the Boston Marathon bombing. His work includes developing tools and approaches for emergency management leaders to build resilience and deal with a rapidly evolving environment. He has been a keynote speaker on emergency management for a number of organizations, including the U.S. Forest Service, the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, the Salvation Army, as well as Public Safety Canada, and has regularly appeared in the media to share his insights on emergency management. Dr. Kabilan has served as an emergency management advisor for a range of public and private sector organizations, and was a member of the Canadian Tri-Services Emergency Management Committee. And I have sat in on probably a dozen of Dr. Kabi's lunch and learns, webinars, lessons learned, and they are all always so very insightful. So I'm so thrilled to have you join us here, Kabi.
Well, hello everyone, and Ben, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm not sure about the smartest person in the room description, but I've also realized I'm sharing the wrong. I'm sharing the nope, I am sharing the right screen. Okay, I take it you can see my presentation now. So what I want to do is take a little bit of a step back from what we were talking about with Steve. Where we talked about people, if you like, quite a bit. And now I want to talk about technology. And when we start thinking about resilience and the challenges that come with it, this is it's an interesting overall piece to look at. I've talked a lot about the people piece, but as you know, we live in a world, and we look at what's happened with the pandemic recently, where, well, things are very, very, very different today. So what does that mean for us in terms of resilience when we're now living in a world where we're so dependent on technology? Most of us are still able to function, our businesses, our work, even this conference, because we have access to a range of digital technologies. So what does this mean for us? And particularly, what does this mean for the concept of resilience, which is something that I've been speaking about for quite a few years now? So before we dive into things, most people know I always like to define things before we get off to a start. And I'd like to start with defining resilience from the perspective of Gartner. We define organizational resilience as the ability to resist, absorb, recover, and adapt to disruption in an ever-changing and increasingly complex environment. So you're continually able to deliver your objectives, rebound, and prosper. It's very much like, the standard rebound curve that many of you have seen. You have your organization progressing as normal. You get hit by an interruption. The resilient organizations don't take as much of a dip and come back to business as usual or business better than usual very, very quickly. And that's the essence of it. And that's just the way that Gartner defines it. So we have resilience, and then we have a strange little environment of zeros and ones that we have to deal with today. So as I was doing a lot of work in emergency management, and Ben alluded to this earlier, I was with the Conference Board of Canada for a number of years, and we did a number of study tours looking at how other regions, other agencies had dealt with major emergencies. One of the study tours was actually to New York City to look at the after effects of Hurricane Sandy. And as we went through our tour of New York, we ended up in the New York Office of Emergency Management. I was very privileged to have another great leader in emergency management actually speak to us that day, and that was Joe Bruno, the former commissioner of the Office of Emergency Management in New York City. He survived several mayors and has been through the job in numerous emergencies. So this man really has been through the ringer and brought the city, through a number of major crises. What was really interesting in the conversation with Joe was one particular phrase. If you lose the data, you lose the emergency. And that really was the catalyst that started us thinking more and more about this whole concept of what role does data and the digital world play in emergencies, and very importantly, in how we think about resilience today and into the future. We know we're becoming more and more dependent on data and more dependent on the virtual world for everything that we do, this pandemic being a great example of that. So what do we do today, and how do we actually start thinking about resilience when it comes to the digital world? We need to add one other layer on top of this, which is the concept of digital disruption. Now, step out of emergency management for a moment and think about the world around you. I'm sure somebody's talked to you about digital disruption, the rise of social media platforms, how they've disrupted advertising in the newspapers, for example. But again, the change in business models that we've seen all over the world, where markets and traditional models of doing business are completely disrupted. Well, I think emergency management and crisis management has seen this, and this is, after all, focused on crisis communications. We've seen that in our communications channels, particularly with the rise of social media. That's been a huge and very significant digital disruption. Like every other industry, emergency management and crisis communication are just as vulnerable to digital disruption. We have to face the fact that this is not just a business issue. This is not just something that someone with an MBA is trying to contend with for a for-profit corporation. This is a major challenge that all of us have to think about in today's environment. So if that is the case, when we start thinking about resilience, we need to start encompassing a new component into it, and that is the digital component of resilience. Much like many corporations are looking at digital disruption, and even governments are looking at digital disruption, what that means to them and how they deal with that, so do we in emergency management and crisis communication. So do we need to look at digital disruption and its impacts on us, because that's going to have a very significant impact ultimately on our resilience and our ability to deal with the emergencies and major crises in front of us. So what I'm going to do today is I've only got 4 short points I want to raise, about 4 big pieces when it comes to the whole concept of digital resilience, and particularly what role data and digital play in building resilience in a modern organization. This definitely applies to, and I'm going to specifically take the case of emergency and crisis management and how digital disruption specifically impacts how you conceive of the world and how you might look at the whole concept of building resilience in this new digitally enabled environment. So, some of you have heard this phrase, data makes the world go round. And just in so many ways, this is true today, particularly with the pandemic. But something happened a few years ago when I was in a scenario exercise in a province in Canada. And we went through a certain disruption scenario. It was actually more to do with power being cut. And what was really interesting was the grocery store or a company that provided food supply, it was a major grocery chain, actually said to us at the end of the exercise, well, we're still not going to really be delivering food. Well, why not? You have fuel, you have electricity, and then the other shoe dropped. It was the fact that in a just-in-time supply chain, you're very much dependent on data to tell you, you know what, I'm short on toilet paper. Well, I guess at one point a few months ago, we were all short on toilet paper. But you need to know that before a decision is made at the warehouse to supply you with more toilet paper. And that information goes down the chain to say, hey, you know what? We're starting to get a lot of demand for toilet paper. We need more orders. What was a fundamental shift in there was the old model of if we have food, if we have fuel, if we have electricity, that's okay. We can ship food. We can get it to a grocery store. We're all good. The new model is unless you have data that flows between that grocery store and whatever warehouse it's getting its supplies from, you may not get those supplies on time. So our societies are significantly vulnerable to data disruption, particularly in this world which we've designed to be hyper efficient and depend on that data for just-in-time supply. So that's one aspect in terms of how data makes the world go round. The other piece is, it's tying into what Joe Bruno said in terms of critical decision making. If you lose the data, you lose the emergency. In your world in crisis management, your world continues to go around when you can make the best decision possible given all of the chaos that's happening around you. We've talked about in the past when I've spoken about leadership, I've talked about the need to make decisions in the absence of data. But now you could actually have a lot of that data available to you. You can improve that decision making just because of our new digitally enabled world. So from filling your grocery store shelves to being able to make better decisions on the ground, data makes the world go round. You need to be able to have access to that data for better decision making and just to be able to keep your supply chains going and resilient. So building resilience in today's world is not anymore just about the traditional food, fuel, and power. Data needs to be a key component to that resilience building model. So what do we actually do about this? Well, I think the first question we need to ask ourselves of organizations is, how important is the flow of data in your considerations of building resilience? Is it actually on your radar? Or are you still basing your concept and models of resilience on the traditional requirements, food, fuel, and power? If we've got those, we're good. Well, we need much more than that. And this is not just about digital communications. It's not just about having social media or a phone available. It is about actual data, zeros and ones, telling us what we've got, what we've not got, and being able to make a decision based on that data. In many ways, we need to start looking at the flow of data much as we would look at any major utility. Again, in a major crisis, that's one of the key areas that we look at almost immediately. Can we get our major utilities up and running so that everybody has the essentials? Data needs to be part of that consideration. And finally, the other big piece about data in the modern world, I will guarantee you that you, as an emergency management professional or as a crisis communications professional, will not have all of the data that you need to be able to make good decisions, to be able to communicate factually in the midst of an emergency. Because of the way our world is structured, a lot of that data may be with your partners. They may be with the private sector. They may be with other agencies. And it's a big step to start thinking about part of your resilience in terms of the digital world and in terms of ensuring that you have access to data is actually building those communications, those networks, the ability to share and move that data properly and quickly. And you need to do it now. This is another challenge in terms of resilience building in a digital world, because actually making the data available, sharing the data creates a whole host of new challenges and new problems, including privacy, particularly when you bring disparate data sets together. When you deal with data from the private sector, when there might be commercially sensitive implications to the data that you're seeing or you're using, you have to be aware of all of that. So, issue number one, creating resilience in a digital world requires you to have a resilient data supply and use strategy. Supply in terms of all of your partners that are out there, ensuring that supply so that those who are in critical positions, your critical infrastructure, which you need to function in the midst of a crisis or an emergency, also has access to that flow, and ultimately also the ability to protect that data. Again, I would argue this is not a traditional piece we think about in terms of emergency management. It's the IT shop's job at the end of the day to try and figure that all out. Well, it isn't anymore. When you start thinking about digital disruption and we step out of emergency management for a moment, the big concepts today in the world of digital are about more and more responsibility coming towards the owners and users of the data. You're creating a product out of that data to make decisions, to enable goods to flow. You need to take more responsibility for that. So when we start thinking about resilience, we also need to start thinking about the models for digital and data that are outside our traditional emergency management sphere and how some of those can be leveraged to make us potentially more resilient in the future. Trust is a rare commodity indeed today. And I believe Dr. Chakraborty earlier today talked about trust in communications. And I have to say that one of the biggest digital disruptions has been to our long-standing media structures. It used to be that you needed to have access to a television station, the licensing that goes with it, the infrastructure, or a radio station, same thing again, before you could get your message out there. Well, today I can sit here in my basement and I can reach thousands of people, if not more, from my cell phone. I have the power to broadcast to a wide range of audiences across the globe. This has created some incredible positive impacts, and we see this all the time. But I think we also see all of the time some of the negative impacts. And one of the biggest challenges in all of this when we start thinking about digital resilience is, unfortunately, not only has communications been digitally disrupted, so has the truth. We've certainly seen a war on facts and on experts for over the last few years. I think certainly after the 2016 US presidential election, this has really come to the fore about the challenges that we have in terms of getting the public to actually believe in experts and to actually engage on a factual discussion. And if you look at social media any day, and by the way, Dr. Jordans earlier was talking to you about trying to keep yourself calm. One of my suggestions for keeping yourself calm is, limiting the amount of time you spend on social media, and particularly political discussions. This is part of the challenge that we face. And what's even worse is, if you have this challenge in terms of misinformation or disinformation in the midst of an emergency, it can be a rather significant problem. A few years ago, I even opined that if this continues, we are going to see loss of life due to this issue. And this is a recent BBC article. They've made some estimates here, but they've also seen, hospitalizations, people coming in for injecting compounds into themselves, which are not going to have their COVID-19 diagnosis, for example. And unfortunately, they approximate that there's at least hundreds of lives which have been lost as a result of misinformation. So when we think in terms of our overall resilience as a society, dealing with trust in how we communicate in the digital world is a major issue. And effectively dealing with mis and disinformation on modern digital platforms is absolutely key to building resilience. You only have to go back to any of the major incidents we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years. Look for the tweets from the officials which go, please follow X, Y, or Z for official news. Do not spread rumors. Do not share things which you can't verify. Because we have a big challenge in this space, a huge challenge, in fact. So what do we do about this? Well, a politician once said, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. That was stated, I believe, in the late 40s or early 50s. Today, a lie gets 17,000 times around the world before the truth even gets out of bed. This is the challenge that we face. It's a constant uphill battle. And let me get this completely straight. You cannot win this on facts alone. Simply stating the facts and dropping the facts is not going to win you the argument. It's not going to get the desired communication that you want, maybe with a small part of your audience, but the truth is under attack, and the truth alone will not win. Dr. Chakraborty mentioned something really important, which is trust. Trust is absolutely key in building resilience when it comes to the digital communication landscape. And trust, first of all, we all know it takes a long time to build and it can be lost in an instant. But one of the things that's forgotten about trust, particularly on these digital platforms, is it's not about you going, okay, let's spin up our communications because we have an emergency. That's the traditional model that many of us have used. It's actually about being there, building your audience, and keeping that rapport going constantly. So, Ben brought up Chief Tom Sampson earlier, and if you look at his tweets during the pandemic, and you actually track back to what he says all across the year, you'll find that there is a constant communication there, even when there isn't a crisis. He's talking about things you can do to prepare, how you look at your world. Do you have a sump pump? He asks the basic questions even when there's no emergency. Builds an audience, builds trust, and is constantly communicating out there. We're not going to simply win the war against misinformation and disinformation easily. There are some big challenges in there, but the first and foremost thing that we all can do in terms of building that digital resilience from a communication standpoint is building trust and our audience. When I started at the Conference Board of Canada, I used to have a single, if you like, sort of slogan and vision, which was be the trusted voice. That is ultimately the only thing that, it's not the only thing, but ultimately one of the key elements that we can use to help combat the challenge and the attacks against the truth and against authority that we have out there. Be the trusted voice, build that and maintain that. This is ultimately a really complex problem. None of us in emergency management are going to solve this tomorrow. In fact, even broader society is probably not going to do it tomorrow. But where we can build resilience is making sure that our audience, those whom we're communicating to, those whom we might need to engage with in the midst of an emergency, they know who we are, they've heard from us before, and they trust us. That's absolutely key to building digital resilience. One of the key areas that I've explored over the course of the years that I was involved in emergency management was the issue of volunteers. And I still remember the days that, the standard emergency management response to volunteers was, yes, very nice, you're here, stand over there and let the professionals get their job done. I think most of us realize that that's not the way to do things anymore, and that volunteers can be a tremendous force multiplier. What's happening, which is really interesting, is a digital disruption in terms of volunteering. Now you think volunteering, well, hang on, how does that actually happen? Well, think about it this way. In the past, traditional crisis, you might have something happen. You might knock on doors. You might put out a radio message to go, could I get some help for people to come in? Can someone come and help us? And again, you're still reliant in some ways on formal channels or formal organizations to do this. But this has changed completely with the advent of social media. Volunteers are setting up their own channels and their own means. They're self-organizing and responding using things like social media platforms, digital channels to help them do that. So we actually did a few studies around volunteers. And one of the things, unfortunately, I did not participate on the actual study tour, but I helped organize this, was actually a study tour to look at Hurricane Harvey and some of the lessons learned from that. One of the biggest lessons was around groups like the Cajun Navy. During Hurricane Harvey, first responders were doing all they can, but in many ways, they were overwhelmed. A little group called the Cajun Navy had realized that people were calling for help. They couldn't get it. They were taking calls for help on Facebook, and they were responding as a result. They were using a digital platform to be able to work like a first responder agency, their own equivalent of a 911 system, and then the ability to use that to find people and to actually rescue them. And they did do, from the reports that I've read, quite a bit of good work in terms of supplementing the efforts of the first responders. What's really interesting here, when you look at this from a digital disruption perspective, is that the capability gap, and this is what digital disruption does, it takes away these barriers where maybe you had to invest in a 911 system and all sorts of controls and communication gear to be able to do this. Now you need a Facebook page and a laptop, and you're done. That's what digital disruption does. It breaks these barriers. It closes the gaps in capabilities between the traditional provider or the traditional organization and something completely new. So this is a huge change in terms of enabling volunteers, because now they have many of the capabilities that we would have as professional emergency managers. So people can call on volunteers to help them directly. How does this change what we do from a digital resilience perspective? Well, we need to adapt to this. I also remember in the early days of social media, the standard line, this is not to be used for emergencies. You'll see people's Twitter handles, do not use this for an emergency, call 911, we won't respond to this. I'm sorry, that's irrelevant. This is a big challenge that we see in digital disruption all the time. The organization and what was there before the disruption might have a certain picture of how things work. And in many ways, it's an imposition. The old school of thinking imposes upon people or stakeholders what they need to do to get help. The new school of thinking goes, where do people go for help? That completely changes on its head the policies that you might have in place around how you respond to calls for help in social media. It was very clear that people were using that as a channel, and there was a Red Cross study from, I believe, about 5 or 6 years ago, which showed that increasing proportion of Canadians who believed that help would come if they asked for it on social media. This is digital disruption at work. It's no longer about imposing something on people and saying, no, you have to call 911 for help. It is about adapting to how people are using technology, how digital platforms are changing, how they interact with us, and about adapting to that need. This is a fundamental shift in how we think about carrying out emergency response. We can no longer say, don't call us on social media. We have to think about how do we now enable that, and how do we now work with this intention from people. We've seen this in digital disruption in the private sector time and time again. There are organizations who look at this world and go, no, 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 no. They need to fit into what I'm selling them. You can look at the history of these organizations. They're usually the ones which have gone bankrupt. And this is a major risk for emergency management in terms of how we work. A failure to adapt to this new reality, honestly, it does risk irrelevance. So this is the third pillar in terms of digital disruption. and building that digital resilience. We have to start thinking about some of those models that we see from digital disruption in other sectors. And a big part of that is adapting to the reality of how our stakeholders, our customers, in this case, our citizens, want to interact with us and regularly interact with the world around them. And that has to be a key channel for us to communicate with them and to work with them in the midst of an emergency. That's a key part of building digital resilience, shifting to the new models of looking and focusing at our customers or stakeholders first, rather than the capabilities we provide to them and getting them to fit into that. The final point I want to raise is the other aspect of digital disruption around the world of volunteers. There's this great story that came out of Hurricane Sandy. One of the biggest problems that they had as the hurricane died down was getting hold of fuel, getting hold of gasoline. You could show up at a gas station, but one, would it have fuel? Was it resupplied, or did it even have any supply left? And two, even if it had supply, would it actually have the electricity, the power to pump that into your vehicle? This was causing a bit of a challenge and a bit of an issue with New Yorkers. And suddenly a little website appeared that started mapping out gas stations and going, okay, there's gas here, there's not here. This was lauded by many as a real lifesaver, a really useful tool for New Yorkers. It was built by a bunch of programmers in Regina, Saskatchewan. They were nowhere near New York. They are not emergency management professionals. They're a group of programmers who were supporting an app called Gas Buddy. Gas Buddy basically lets you put in the price of gas wherever you see it, so that if you're driving around, you can look at the app and go, hey, where's the cheapest gas? What they noticed was that as people were struggling to find gas and the ability to actually pump gas in the city of New York, they were seeing the comments in the app, and they said, well, if that's what they want, couldn't we just take that data and turn it into a little website that told people where there are gas stations where they could get gas? Simple idea. By the way, they turned that around in just a couple of hours. I would challenge you to find a major government-run public sector organization which could do that in just a couple of hours, but they did it. So we've gone not only from digitally enabling physical volunteers to a completely new category because of the digital world, and that is virtual volunteers. This generally refers to volunteering activities that can be completed whole or in part using the internet or internet-connected devices. And it can be done anywhere across the globe. So this is, and I know that in many ways, when I started off working in emergency management in Canada, we were trying to figure out, a volunteer strategy and trying to turn the tables around that very old model of keeping the volunteers at bay and letting the professionals work. Well, I think we sort of figured most of that out. And then we had to figure out the digitally enabled volunteer piece, where people could come together as groups and actually use those digital platforms rather than what the emergency management professionals have. And we're hitting yet another disruption, completely virtual volunteers. So the first question that I would ask in terms of building a digital resilience is, what is your virtual volunteer strategy? I'm sure you should have a volunteer strategy. You probably have, or I'm hoping you're designing something that works with the digitally enabled volunteer piece. But how do you work with a completely virtual volunteer scheme? There are certainly communities in this space that help spin up virtual volunteers and bring them in. That's another community that you probably need to be engaged in if you're thinking about building digital resilience. From a crisis communications perspective, one of the things that crisis communicators can do really in this space is look at those streets, because when these groups spin up, you do tend to get some form of communication which starts mentioning them. And if they are having an impact, they will show up. So how you do your communications analytics might help you actually identify when these groups are emerging and actually help you engage with them, because the first step to engaging with them is knowing that they actually exist and that they are doing something. So that's a key role that crisis communicators can play in this space. And again, as with digitally enabled volunteers, this is a huge disruption because not only now are the volunteers separated from you by a digital platform, they may be separated from you by several borders and several time zones, but they're still able to contribute in the midst of an emergency. As it was in the early days of dealing with the disruption of how volunteers were changing the face of emergency management and how our strategies had to change with that, virtual volunteers are another significant disruption in here. And given that example that I mentioned about Gas Buddy, they can actually provide significant assistance to organizations dealing with a major crisis. So again, they're a key component of that digital resilience model because they're now a new force multiplier that you can add to your repertoire when dealing with any crisis or emergency. So those are the four pillars that I wanted to talk about today, but just cycling back to where we started. The whole idea of digital disruption, this is not something that just affects the business world or just affects, government servants sitting in their offices and trying to provide, services to everyday citizens. This affects us all. And this digital disruption has come to emergency management in a number of ways. I've highlighted four pillars here, and I think that as we consider building digital resilience for the future, these are four pillars that you need to keep in mind. And I think they're absolutely critical as we start thinking and reworking how the concept of resilience looks going forward. The basics are the same. You want an organization that isn't hit as hard and is able to come back faster when hit by a crisis. The big difference is we're not looking at the purely physical aspects on their own when we consider resilience. We have to start thinking about all of these digital components. Component number one, data, data, data. Data to help you make decisions from an emergency management perspective. Data from your partners, because you're going to need that to be able to get a broader picture of what's happening. And data to and from the variety of partners whom you work with. Because ultimately, in today's just-in-time environment, your supply chains and a lot of your critical functions are going to be dependent on the flow of data. So resilience in the flow of data, in the availability of data, and in the sharing of data are absolutely key. That's pillar one. Pillar two in digital resilience is essentially the information war or the war on truth. And whilst you can't solve this, a key part of building your resilience in this environment is ensuring that you have that trust, as Dr. Chakraborty mentioned. You need to be able to be that trusted voice in an environment that's full of other loud voices, particularly on the digital plane. Build that audience, build that trust, and maintain it. That means a lot of work, particularly for crisis communicators, that may be happening well outside of a crisis. Pillar number three, or you could call it 3A, since the next two are both about volunteers, is about digitally enabled volunteers. So this is really about the disruption of, if you like, the tools and the barriers to getting into that market of providing a service to someone who's been disrupted or impacted by a major emergency or crisis. You have to recognize that much like we see in the business world, this is a disruption in terms of the service that emergency management professionals provide. It is a big challenge, and it's a very important one that you need to be aware of. If you're not able to play in the space, if you're not able to cope with this disruption and actually leverage it, you risk irrelevance in many ways. Again, the example that I shared showed that when people found they could not rely on official channels to get help, they went to those unofficial channels and help came. So we need to figure out how we work with them. And a key part of that, disruption is changing our mindsets to more of a digital model that we see in the private sector, which is about understanding where our customers or our stakeholders or citizens in this case, where they are going, what they use and what they need, rather than us saying, here's how you communicate with us, here's how you do business with us. Finally, the last pillar you need to think about when it comes to, or at least the last in this presentation, when it comes to building digital resilience, is that your partners may be completely virtual. So that's a further disruption to the volunteer model. Gas Buddy is a great example of how people can do that. But again, if you think about the first two pieces around data being a central requirement, around needing to be there in that whole information war piece, these are new partners who might be able to help you deal with some of those issues. So being a part of that conversation, and maybe here's a great role for crisis communicators to play in terms of identifying some of these emerging groups, because people will be talking about them and the services they provide, and then bringing them in the tent, making them part and parcel of what you do. But you need a strategy for this. It's not easy, and it again speaks to that changing mindset about more and more of the responsibility for some of those digital pieces coming to those who use the service. So coming to the forefront of emergency management rather than being stuck in the back room with IT. If you're interested, there's a whole bunch of resources available through Gartner. For those of you who have a Gartner subscription, you can access these quite easily, or ping me an email if you'd like to talk about it further. But I think that this is a core requirement for emergency management today. We are not exempt from digital disruption. We are just as vulnerable, and we need to pay just as much attention as everyone else to digital disruption. Thank you very much.
Abby, thank you. There was so much in there, and I have a full page of notes, and a couple questions and a couple comments sitting there. It's amazing to me how it's so interconnected, and you had said something, and then I wrote down Cajun Navy because I wanted to ask you about that, and then you got to it. The one thing I think that's really interesting about Cajun Navy is currently, if you look at most 911 systems currently, 911 systems will not take calls for service through social channels.
Yep.
And they'll refer them back to, if this is an emergency, call 911. But in some instances with cell tower failures and phone system overloading, they're reaching out on social, being told to call 911 and then not able to get through on the phone lines. And I think that's what was happening with the Cajun Navy, is that they just started stepping in and answering those
Absolutely.
911 calls. And so I think, so that's going to put tremendous pressure on all of our municipal 911 systems to adapt to this digital disruption.
It's a vicious cycle at the end of the day, Ben, because you try and call 911, it doesn't work. You then get a message on social that says call 911 an emergency, and you're trapped in this cycle. You start, and this goes to the other point around losing trust, you then start losing trust in those sending you the message to call 911. So it's a vicious cycle that pushes the citizens away from you to asking others for help, but also starts deteriorating the trust that you might have built up in your social channels, because they've listened to your social channels and it didn't work. So it's a very dangerous cycle here, and we do need to start thinking about how we change this.
Cajun Navy, was that 2016?
That was during Hurricane Harvey. They recently deployed again during the recent hurricane season. And again, there'll be people talking about the pros and cons about having a group like this work through an emergency. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is a replacement for good professional emergency or first responders. But at the same time, when we're overwhelmed, how do we best leverage what is now a huge resource in front of us? And I think that's the question we need to be asking, not the health and safety of, oh my God, who are these untrained individuals showing up? I think the better question to ask is, you've got a resource, what's the best way to utilize this?
Now, Bob Jensen's just corrected me. 2017 was Cajun Navy. 2017. Thanks, Bob. Bob also, do you know Bob Jensen, Kevin?
I recognize the name. I think
you guys should connect. Anyways, Bob is saying, this to your presentation, this is why the move forward towards more public-private partnerships is a good thing. And also noting that in many circumstances, the private sector will outperform the public sector. And so give those considerations. And you talked earlier about relationships, and that ties into one of the questions. Have you seen any case studies or developments between private companies and police fire departments that have been successful of managing emergency communications via social. So in other words, has anyone come up with successful ways to take social reports of an issue, like a downed power line, and relay it from a utility social media feed to an emergency response department like the fire department?
So I haven't seen that happen directly. My understanding is, at least in the city of Ottawa, for instance, that it does happen indirectly in terms of some of those communications. I think there's a bit of a roundabout way for it to go there. The challenge, I think, for us is not so much whether that connection is there, but how quick and instantaneous can we make that connection? If you're the hydro company or the power company and you receive a downline report, shouldn't that automatically go to public safety as well, or to emergency management as well, because there's a situation, there's a public safety issue that goes with it? I think that's the bigger question. I've seen the informal pieces happen, certainly within CEMA and the city of Calgary, the way they work with their partners. I know that NMAX in particular, in terms of how they work with CEMA, I'm not sure that they've built anything that's an automated, if the data comes to NMAX, it gets dumped into CEMA. Now, I haven't spoken to CEMA about this directly for a couple of years, but certainly there is the connection through the people that if something does come in through social that they take seriously, then that will be communicated through the channels they have back to CEMA. What I'd really like to see, and where I think you start really building your digital resilience, is taking the next step to that and having that as an automated function. That's what digital should enable you. You don't have to wait for, the VP to get up to call their connection in CEMA, and then the CEMA connection to go, okay, we need to get someone over there. You literally want it to flow from your data to their data instantaneously. That's where we start getting resilience, because we get that instant response and we're not waiting for the chain to link up on its own.
Okay, I'm going to ask a two-parter. One is mine and one is Cole's. So Cole is asking, digital disruptions can also be a source of crisis. So what are your perspectives on fighting fire with fire, so to speak? And then I think what fits in there is if you could just unpack a little bit the difference between misinformation and disinformation.
Yep. Okay. So let's start with the fighting fire with fire. That is actually a common concept. It is disrupt the disruptor. It is a mantra that's used in Silicon Valley, and it's used all across the world by entrepreneurs. And in fact, I used to lecture on this over a decade ago. And yes, you can actually use disruption to disrupt the disruption that's coming at you. That does create a number of different challenges. If you start thinking about how we're set up in terms of, just think about emergency management, think about the rules that we have to follow. Much of this is, even if you're in the private sector, we're very rule bound. So the challenge of disrupting the disruptor it's actually, exponentially harder than just keeping up with the disruption. So the answer, for me is yes, try and do that if you can, but don't be surprised if you're not set up to do so. So maybe the first step is, can you actually catch up to the disruptors? Can you understand the new playing field and play in that field before you try to fight fire with fire? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So misinformation and disinformation, there's a slight difference between the two. Disinformation is purposely false. It's the purpose use of false information. You are definitely taking false information. You know it's false, and you want to use it to create an impact. Misinformation is when you believe something to be true and are sharing it on the belief that it's true, but it's not. And you get a mix of both in the midst of emergencies. Unfortunately, the disinformation part can be, again, I'm going back to my national security background. It's unfortunately, you get this quite a bit from that perspective, but you also get people playing all sorts of games in the midst of an emergency. I believe during one of the last major hurricanes, there was the Photoshop picture of the shark swimming down a major highway that was flooded. Someone purposely did that. That is disinformation. So you get a mix of both in any crisis, and you have to fight both in any crisis. What makes this really challenging is misinformation in particular. People tend to reshare on social media based on emotional cues. Now, going back to what Steve Jordans was saying just before I came on, when we're stressed, we resort to that emotional, that sort of that limbic system. We resort to our internal biases, and that actually then spurs others. So when you're in a crisis, that emotion triggers you even more, and you get these things shared even more. So we're facing a real uphill battle when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, particularly in a crisis situation. When something that's emotional is more than likely to trigger people to reshare it and continue to access it and be taken by it. So it is a big challenge we have to deal with. I would treat both in a similar manner, regardless of whether it comes from someone who's well-meaning, thinking that's the right piece of information to share, or whether it's coming from someone purposely trying to sow the wrong information. I would treat them equally in many ways, because what you really want at the end of the day is for those whom you're communicating with to actually get the right information.
Right. Yeah. And it's the other challenge too is the staffing requirements for organizations now. I remember during the 2013 floods, I had one full-time social media person in the OC. 4 years later, we declared a snow route parking ban, and it took 4 staff 30 days to get through all of the comments and all of the social conversation about the snow route parking ban. And so it just demonstrates how much energy and time goes into clearing that mis and disinformation so that the accurate information coming from that trusted source has a chance of making it through all of that noise.
Well, going back to that question that was asked about fighting fire with fire, well, that is actually potentially an opportunity to fight fire with fire. There's an increasing amount of technology coming in to help you do automated chatbots. Today are incredible in so many ways, and they can start passing through some of the language that's in social media and in those discussions, and help you actually send a message back out, or actually pass through all of them and say, here's the issues you're getting. You need to respond with X, Y, and Z. So that may be an option there, Ben, for actually fighting fire with fire and disrupting the disruption that you're getting.
Okay, were you cheating and looking at the other questions sitting there in the chat, in the question box?
I do have it up here.
Okay, good. So the question then about chat bots and what your thoughts are. So I'll just leave you to answer that one, and then we'll thank you very much.
Yeah, so that is about where customers will expect us to be next. So you're already looking ahead to using analytics, and this is a question from Amanda Ash around you already understand they want more social. They interact with things like chatbots regularly. Where will we go next? That's a really good question, Amanda. I wish I could tell you definitively where we go next, but I don't know. This is, again, part of the challenge in a digitally disrupted world. It changes very quickly. Gartner's been talking about a concept of what we call the composable business, which is how you architect yourselves internally so that you're easily able to shift to meet your new realities. What I would say to you, Amanda, is it's now becoming more important not to say, here's what I'm predicting, 5 years down the line, and so I'm going to build a capability. But more important to start talking about, how do I ensure that the people I'm hiring, the systems I'm putting in place, are actually flexible and adaptable. So when something changes, they can change and adapt to them, because there's no way we're going to predict all of this. But there certainly are ways to make sure we're more flexible and can adapt to those changes.
Dr. Kabi, always so insightful. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you as always. And insightful and brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Have a great day. And it's been I'm glad I've had a few minutes here and there to jump in on a couple of the presentations so far. Great conference.
Great, thank you. Well, make sure you stick around. We have 2 presentations left coming up at the top of the hour. Mr. Zach Zalkowski, he is with Alberta Council, and you've hung in this long. Stick around for the last one. Dr. Athena Madden. She's being joined by other PhD researchers literally from around the world, and together they're going to provide some amazing insights. They kind of put together their own panel discussion. So I'm really intrigued to see what they're going to bring, and then that'll bring virtually Crisis Conference to a close. So thank you so much again, Cabby, for being here. And we'll just be back in about 5 minutes if you need to take a quick break and grab a Coke.